30,000 feet above the English Channel, Thomas Ashford discovered what it meant to be invisible. The sun was rising behind him, painting the sky in shades of coral and amber, and his pink Spitfire had become part of that canvas. He checked his instruments with trembling fingers: altitude steady, airspeed climbing, fuel sufficient for the return journey. Below him, the French coast emerged from the morning haze like a wound across the earth. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine hummed its steady song. Thomas had never flown this high before. The air was thin and brutally cold despite his heated flight suit. Ice crystals formed on the inside of his canopy. He breathed slowly through his oxygen mask and tried to remember everything Sidney Cotton had taught him during yesterday's briefing. The reconnaissance cameras required absolute precision. The F-24 units mounted behind his cockpit would capture overlapping photographs as he flew straight and level over the target. Any banking, any change in altitude, any deviation from the flight path would blur the images and waste the entire mission. Cotton had explained this with the patience of a man who had heard every objection. The pink paint would hide the aircraft. The cameras would capture the truth. The pilots simply had to hold still and trust. Thomas crossed the French coast north of Calais and felt his heart hammering against his ribs. German anti-aircraft batteries studded the coastline. He knew this from the briefing maps, but no black puffs of flak appeared around him. The gunners below were scanning the sky, searching for the familiar silhouettes of enemy aircraft. They saw nothing. The pink Spitfire was a ghost passing through their world. He began his photography run. 90 seconds of flying straight and level while the cameras clicked their mechanical rhythm beneath his seat. He could see the harbor at Calais now, crowded with vessels. Barges. Dozens of them. Long, flat-bottomed boats designed for crossing the channel and landing troops on English beaches. His stomach tightened. The invasion was real. Hitler was coming. 50 seconds into the run, movement caught his eye. 3 dark shapes climbing from an airfield to the south. Messerschmitt 109s. The finest fighters in the German arsenal, flown by pilots who had conquered Poland and France and Norway. They were spiraling upward in a search pattern, hunting for whatever reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted on radar. Thomas gripped the control column and forced himself to breathe. Every instinct screamed at him to dive, to run, to do something. The fighters were climbing fast. In 2 minutes they would reach his altitude. He had no guns, no armor, no wingmen to call for help. He had only the paint and the mission and the desperate hope that Cotton's theory was correct. 70 seconds. The cameras kept clicking. The fighters kept climbing. Thomas watched them through his canopy, 3 dark crucifixes against the brightening sky. His hands wanted to move the controls. His body wanted to flee. He thought about Edward on the beach at Dunkirk, standing still while the world exploded around him. Perhaps courage was not about charging forward. Perhaps it was about refusing to run. 80 seconds. The lead Messerschmitt passed within 200 yards of his aircraft. Thomas could see the pilot's head turning, searching. Their eyes met across the void, or seemed to. The German frowned, shook his head, and banked away. He had seen something, a shimmer in the pink sky, a shape that did not quite belong. But nothing solid enough to chase. Nothing worth the ammunition. 90 seconds. The cameras stopped. Thomas allowed himself one shallow breath, then began his turn toward home. The fighters were still circling below him, confused predators who had lost the scent of their prey. He climbed higher, pushing the Spitfire toward 40,000 feet, and watched France fall away beneath his wings. The return flight passed in a strange blur of relief and exhaustion. Thomas landed at Benson just as the ground crews were finishing their morning tea. Wing Commander Hughes met him on the runway, his face tight with anxiety. The photographs were rushed to the intelligence section. Thomas waited in the briefing room, drinking bitter coffee and staring at his shaking hands. The results came back within the hour. 17 invasion barges. 4 destroyers. A submarine pen under construction. Clear, sharp images that would reach Churchill's desk before sunset. Hughes looked at Thomas with something that might have been respect. The pink paint had worked. The mission had succeeded. And Thomas Ashford, the pilot who could not fight, had done something his brave brother never could. He returned to his quarters that evening and opened the letter to Edward. He added one line at the bottom, "I think I finally understand." Then he sealed the envelope and placed it in his footlocker, a promise kept to a ghost. The aircraft looked like a terrible joke. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford stood in the dim hangar at RAF Benson, staring at a Spitfire painted the color of a summer rose. Behind him, 3 pilots burst into laughter. One called it the circus plane. Another asked if they were fighting Germans or entertaining children at birthday parties. Thomas did not laugh. He had requested this assignment, and now he understood why command had granted it so easily. No one else wanted it. October 1940 had stripped England of illusions. The Battle of Britain was grinding toward its end, but the skies remained full of death. Every day brought new empty chairs in mess halls across the country. Every night brought the distant thunder of bombs falling on London. And here, in this quiet corner of Oxfordshire, the Royal Air Force had built something strange, a unit of pilots who carried cameras instead of guns, who painted their aircraft absurd colors, who flew alone into enemy territory and prayed the Germans would not see them. They called it the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. The pilots called it the place where careers went to die. Thomas walked closer to the pink Spitfire and ran his fingers along its wing. The paint felt smooth and cold. Someone had modified the aircraft heavily. They had removed all the guns, stripped away the armor plating, and sealed the gun ports with metal covers to reduce drag. In place of 8 Browning machine guns, the plane now carried 2 cameras bolted into the fuselage behind the cockpit. It was fast, light, and completely defenseless. He thought about his brother Edward, who had died on the beaches at Dunkirk 5 months ago. Edward had been brave. Edward had charged into German machine gun fire to drag wounded men toward the evacuation boats. Edward had died with a rifle in his hands and courage in his heart. Thomas had spent that same week flying patrol missions over the Channel, too far away to help, too scared to volunteer for the dangerous runs closer to shore. The memory still burned. Wing Commander Geoffrey Hughes appeared beside him, a gray-haired man with tired eyes and a permanent cigarette between his fingers. He studied Thomas for a long moment before speaking. "The PRU needed pilots badly," he explained. They had lost 6 men in 3 weeks. The standard camouflage was not working. Blue Spitfires stood out against the pink and orange skies of dawn. German fighters were picking them off like targets at a fairground. Then a civilian named Sidney Cotton had arrived with an idea that sounded like madness. Cotton was Australian, loud, and convinced he understood something the military did not. He had noticed that at certain altitudes, during certain times of day, the sky turned shades of pink and purple. A blue aircraft looked like a bruise against that canvas. But a pink aircraft disappeared. Hughes gestured at the rose-colored Spitfire. This was Cotton's experiment. Tomorrow morning, someone would fly it over the French coast and photograph the German positions at Calais. Intelligence believed Hitler was massing invasion barges. Churchill needed proof. The mission required flying at 30,000 feet, holding perfectly straight and level for 90 seconds while the cameras clicked, and trusting that the absurd paint would hide the pilot from every German eye in the sky. Thomas understood what Hughes was really asking. The mission was nearly suicidal. The other pilots thought the pink paint was a joke. No one wanted to die in a plane that looked like a toy, but Thomas remembered freezing at the controls during his first combat mission. He remembered his wingman screaming at him over the radio while a Messerschmitt lined up behind them. He remembered the shame that came afterward, the quiet transfer, the looks from men who knew he had failed. He was not brave like Edward. He could not fight. Perhaps he could do this instead. He told Hughes he would fly the mission. The wing commander nodded slowly, unsurprised. He had seen something in Thomas that the younger man did not yet understand, not cowardice, but a different kind of fear, the kind that could be transformed into stillness rather than action. That night, Thomas sat alone in his quarters and wrote a letter to his dead brother. He described the pink Spitfire, the mission, the strange hope that he might finally do something useful. He wrote about their childhood in Manchester, about the art classes they had taken together before the war turned everything gray. He wrote about fear and courage and the thin line between them that he did not seal the envelope. He wanted to add one more line when he returned. If he returned. He placed the letter beneath his pillow and tried to sleep, but the image of that rose-colored aircraft haunted him until dawn. 6 pink Spitfires sat in a row outside the main hangar, their rose-colored paint catching the weak winter sunlight. Thomas Ashford stood before 12 new pilots and tried to find words that would not get them killed. The men watched him with barely hidden contempt. They were fighter pilots, warriors who had shot down German aircraft and earned medals for bravery. They had been transferred to the photographic reconnaissance unit against their wishes, and they blamed Thomas for the insult. The winter of 1940 had brought a strange pause to the war. Hitler's invasion fleet sat idle in French harbors, frozen by weather and the RAF's stubborn resistance. But the need for intelligence had only grown. Command wanted photographs of every factory, every airfield, every railway junction in occupied Europe. The PRU was expanding, and it needed pilots who could fly the dangerous missions Thomas had pioneered. Sergeant William Marsh stepped forward from the group. He was 23 years old, broad-shouldered, with 4 confirmed kills painted on the side of his Hurricane before they transferred him here. His voice carried the sharp edge of wounded pride. He wanted to know why he should take orders from a man who had never shot down anything. He wanted to know why courage now meant running away. Thomas understood the anger. He had felt it himself, months ago, when his own failure had sent him to this place of exile. He did not argue with Marsh. Instead, he walked to the nearest pink Spitfire and climbed into the cockpit. He invited the sergeant to follow in another aircraft. They would fly together, and Marsh would see what reconnaissance demanded. They took off into a gray December sky and climbed toward the channel. Thomas explained the mission parameters through the radio, the altitude requirements, the camera timing, the absolute necessity of holding straight and level during photography runs. Marsh listened with growing impatience. This was simple flying, he argued. Any pilot could do this. Thomas spotted the training target, a mock convoy of trucks arranged on a field near Dover, and began his approach. He instructed Marsh to follow his exact flight path while maintaining formation. The cameras would photograph the target while they held steady for 90 seconds. Halfway through the run, Thomas did something unexpected. He radioed the base and asked them to scramble 2 Hurricane fighters for a simulated interception. Within minutes, the Hurricanes appeared on their tail, closing fast. Marsh's voice came through the radio, sharp with alarm. He wanted to break formation. He wanted to evade. Thomas told him to hold course. The Hurricanes roared past them, engines screaming, close enough to shake both Spitfires with their wake turbulence. Marsh cursed and banked hard to the left, his instincts overwhelming his discipline. Thomas continued straight and level, cameras clicking, until the run was complete. They landed in silence. The ground crew developed both sets of photographs within the hour. Thomas's images showed perfect clarity, every truck visible, every detail sharp. Marsh's photographs showed nothing but blurred sky and the distant smear of the English coastline. His break had lasted less than 3 seconds. It had ruined everything. Thomas found Marsh alone in the ready room that evening, staring at his failed photographs. He sat beside the younger pilot and spoke quietly about Dunkirk. About his brother Edward, who had been brave in the way everyone understood. About freezing at the controls during his first combat mission. About the shame that had followed him here, to this strange unit of unarmed aircraft and impossible missions. Reconnaissance was not about running away, Thomas explained. It was about a different kind of courage, the courage to be still when every nerve demanded movement. The Germans could not see a pink Spitfire at dawn if the pilot held his nerve. But the moment a pilot flinched, the moment he broke the flight path, he became visible. He became a target. He became dead. Marsh flew again 3 days later. Over Brest, he photographed the German battleship Scharnhorst while 2 Messerschmitts circled below him. He held his course for the full 90 seconds, fingers white on the control column, watching the enemy fighters search for something to kill. They never found him. The pink ghost was invisible. He returned to Benson with photographs that showed the battleship's exact position, its armament configuration, its fuel lines and ammunition stores. Intelligence would use these images to plan the bombing raids that eventually drove Scharnhorst from its harbor. Marsh found Thomas in the hangar and extended his hand. No words were necessary. The gesture said everything. By spring, the Germans had noticed something strange. Reconnaissance photographs were appearing from locations they believed were impossible to reach. Their intelligence services began investigating. They found rumors of pink aircraft, ghost planes that vanished into the dawn sky. They called them Die Rosa Geister, the pink ghosts, and they started hunting. The morning sky burned orange and gold as Thomas Ashford crossed the French coast for the 47th time. Spring had come to Europe, painting the fields below in shades of green that made the war seem almost distant. He could see villages and farmhouses and roads that looked peaceful from 30,000 feet. Only the columns of gray trucks and the black scars of bomb craters reminded him that this was occupied territory, a land held by men who would kill him if they could see him. His mission today was different. Intelligence had identified a suspected heavy water facility near Saint-Nazaire, deep in Brittany. Heavy water was essential for certain types of nuclear research that might give Hitler weapons beyond imagination. Churchill needed photographs. The scientists needed proof. And Thomas needed to fly deeper into enemy territory than any PRU aircraft had ever gone. Billy Marsh flew on his wing, 200 yards to starboard. They had become friends over the winter months, bound together by shared terror and shared purpose. Billy had stopped questioning the pink paint long ago. He had learned what Thomas knew, that courage came in many colors, and sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was hold perfectly still. They crossed the Loire River and turned southwest toward their target. The weather was clear, the visibility unlimited, the conditions perfect for photography. The conditions were also perfect for German fighters. Thomas saw them first, for Messerschmitt 109s climbing from an airfield near Nantes. They were moving fast, their engines trailing white contrails against the blue sky. Someone had spotted the pink ghosts. Someone had finally learned how to see them. He calculated distances and times in his head. The target was still 15 minutes away. The fighters would reach their altitude in 8 minutes. There was no way to complete the mission and escape. There was no way to fight. There was only the choice that reconnaissance pilots always faced, the mission or survival. Thomas made his decision quickly. He ordered Billy to continue toward the target while he drew the fighters away. Billy's voice crackled through the radio, angry and desperate. He refused to leave his flight leader. He demanded another option, but there was no other option. Thomas reminded him of everything they had learned together. The photographs mattered more than any pilot. The mission was always bigger than the men who flew it. That was what made them different from the warriors with guns. That was what made them necessary. He turned toward the German fighters and flew straight at them. Not attacking, he had no weapons for that. Simply presenting himself as a target, a sacrifice, a distraction. The lead Messerschmitt hesitated, confused by the strange pink aircraft that neither fled nor fought. Then the German pilot made his decision. He rolled into a pursuit curve and opened fire. Thomas dived toward the clouds below, his engine screaming at maximum power. Cannon shells tore through his tail section. His instrument panel shattered. Oil sprayed across his canopy, black and hot, blinding him to everything except the knowledge that he was falling. Behind him, Billy Marsh disappeared into the clouds and continued toward Saint-Nazaire. He photographed the heavy water facility with steady hands and burning eyes, knowing that Thomas had given him these minutes with his life. The pink Spitfire crashed in a wheat field outside a village called Pornic. German soldiers reached the wreckage within 20 minutes. They found an empty cockpit, a shattered camera, and a pool of blood that led toward the nearby forest. The pilot had survived the impact. The pilot had run. Thomas spent 3 days hiding in a drainage ditch before members of the French resistance found him. They were farmers and shopkeepers, ordinary people who had chosen to fight in their own quiet way. They looked at his pink flight suit, stained now with blood and mud, and asked what kind of aircraft he flew. When he told them, they laughed. They had heard rumors of the rose-colored ghosts. They had never believed the stories were true. They smuggled him from farmhouse to farmhouse, village to village, across the dangerous landscape of occupied France. The journey took 7 months. Thomas learned to speak basic French. He learned to move through shadows. He learned that courage existed in many forms, not just in the men who flew but in the women who hid them and the children who kept their secrets. That he reached England in December 1941, thin and bearded and quiet. Wing Commander Hughes met him at the airfield with tears in his eyes. Billy Marsh stood beside him, now a flight lieutenant himself, wearing the distinguished flying cross that Thomas's sacrifice had earned him. The photographs from St. Nazaire had changed the war. The heavy water facility was bombed 3 weeks after Billy's mission. German nuclear research was delayed by months. Lives were saved, perhaps thousands, perhaps millions, by images captured through a camera lens while the enemy searched for ghosts they could not see. Hughes asked Thomas if he wanted a rest. A desk job, perhaps. Training duties. Anything that kept him away from the dangerous skies. Thomas looked at the pink Spitfires lined up on the runway. His squadron. His ghosts. He thought about Edward, who had died bravely on a beach. He thought about Billy, who had learned that holding still was its own kind of bravery. He thought about the farmers and shopkeepers of France, who had risked everything for a stranger in a rose-colored flight suit that he asked for a fresh camera and a full tank of fuel. Dawn the next morning. A pink Spitfire climbed into the brightening sky over the channel, catching the light and seeming to dissolve into the colors of sunrise. On a German observation post far below, a young soldier looked up and saw nothing at all. The ghost had returned. The war continued. And somewhere above the clouds, Thomas Ashford finally understood what his brother had known all along, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to matter anyway.